Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Mormon Stories podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. I have a bit of an alternative introduction today. I am recording an introduction separate from the actual recorded interview because there were some technical difficulties in this interview. So welcome to another episode of Mormon Stories podcast. Something that's not different between this episode and others is how excited I am to introduce this amazing, what I think is kind of an epic story. Today we are going to be playing for you an interview with Emily and Kyle Davis. This is an interview that I conducted on July 12th, 2018 in the Woodlands in Houston, Texas. And this interview is epic because it deals with Emily and Kyle's mixed faith marriage that lasted 14 years. In other words, Emily and Kyle were raised LDS. They got married, and Kyle at some point early in their marriage lost his faith in the church, and they went another 14 years in a mixed faith marriage before Emily was able to really understand what Kyle was going through, and where they were able to get to a really happy, healthy place. So that's kind of epic. So there's so many people who are in a mixed faith marriage, or one person loses their faith and another one doesn't, and they need help knowing how to navigate that. Well, this interview is going to help you with that. So what you're about to hear, you'll hear their early years. You'll hear about Emily and Kyle's respective upbringings in the church. You'll hear about what caused Kyle to doubt. And then you'll hear about how they navigated, 14 years as a mixed faith couple, how they dealt with that, what mistakes they made, what they did right. And then finally, you'll hear what changed in Emily's life that helped them get on the same page and kind of where they are now. It's a great interview. And the reason why we're recording this introduction is because there were some audio problems right at the beginning of the interview that made it hard to hear me. So you'll hear Emily and Kyle fine, but you'll hear my questions be sort of faint. And I just want to let you know that's going to happen. And for about 10 minutes of the interview, my voice will be really faint. But that corrects because I do some adjustments to the audio, and the rest of the interview should be fine. But please welcome to this interview. Thank you for checking it out. And we now will splice in our interview of Emily and Kyle Davis's epic Mormon mixed faith journey of 14 years. And we know you're going to enjoy it. So please enjoy it. Thanks for tuning in. Emily and Kyle, welcome to Mormon Stories podcast. It's such a delight to have you.
Thank you for coming to our home. We're super appreciative, number one, that we get to document our story. We think that's important for our kids in the future and our posterity, so to speak. So we're grateful to have it recorded and a history of our own. I've been an avid viewer of Mormon Stories for many years and recognize that they have been instrumental in my faith transition, but as well as other podcasts. But that I understand, that the stories that come out of Mormon Stories are really just that. They're someone's Mormon experience, which is, different from others' Mormon experiences. And they are just stories. They're authentic and they're full of integrity. And so we're grateful to be able to share ours today. And, we're hopeful that our being transparent about our journey is helpful to someone else. That's the intent of our sharing our story. We get as personal as to share that at one point there was on more than one occasion we talked about separation and divorce, and there are a lot of reasons to get divorced. A difference of religious preference should not be one, and so that's what we hope to convey today. And in fact, to the contrary, it should be embraced and valued, and that wasn't necessarily something I believed for quite some time. And so, if anything, this is a what not to do, at least from Emily's perspective.
Because it was a bumpy ride?
It was a bumpy ride. So I didn't always believe that, there was a time that relationships weren't as important as my beliefs, I guess I should say.
Well, it's beautiful. Well, Kyle, it's also great to have you. Thanks for being willing to do this.
Absolutely. Glad to have you in our home, and we're excited to tell our story.
All right. So I guess as we always begin, let's begin kind of with your respective journeys as Mormons. Who had the most normal Mormon upbringing?
This guy.
I did.
All right, Kyle, do you want to go ahead and just kind of tell us about your Mormon upbringing?
Sure. Yeah, I grew up, for all intents and purposes, in Provo, Utah, so right there at ground zero. Grew up in, I would say, a very loving, mostly traditional household. I'm the third of four children, so I have three siblings. I have an older brother, an older sister, and a younger sister. But growing up in Provo, we were very much the prototypical Mormon family. Family home evenings every Monday night. We wouldn't miss a Monday night. Up before school, with a book where my mom would read a chapter or a few verses out of the Book of Mormon before we all left for the day. So very much the traditional family. I think in one way that I don't think we were traditional was this kind of the activity or the trains running on time, so to speak. That was largely my mom driving that effort. My dad was certainly a participant, although more of a passive participant in this traditional Mormon machine. But no, I had a great childhood. I had a lot of good friends. Of course, growing up in Provo, almost every one of my good friends were also Mormon, and I didn't know any different. I just thought that was the way it is. Pretty traditional Mormon story. I will say that, even in this traditional paradigm, I never really attempted to gain a kind of my own personal testimony of the church. I was more just kind of going along with the current, and checking all the boxes. All the way through the deacons, teachers, priests quorum. I was for example, I was an Eagle Scout by the time I was 14. I mean, very much kind of doing what I was told to do and not thinking too much about it. I don't want to get too far down the road, but I guess when I graduated from high school, my dream was to play college football. The only problem was I was about 150 pounds soaking wet, and you can probably imagine there weren't a whole lot of major football schools or universities beating down my door wanting me to come play for them. But the one school that showed some interest and actually offered a scholarship was what was then Rick's College. So I actually, after high school, went up to Rick's College to play football. And the way that it works at Rick's College, or at least when they had a football program, they don't anymore, is you go up there and all of the freshmen right out of high school, they actually don't play on the team. They redshirt. So you're basically going to practices, you're still going to school, but you're not playing on the team. And so you don't burn a year of eligibility. And then what you do is you go for a year and then you go on your mission for 2 years. And then when you come back from your mission, you're ready to play, and you still have 2 years of college eligibility where you can go beat up on unsuspecting 18-year-olds. All the teams we played were 18 and 19 years old, and the Rick's College team is made up of a bunch of 21 and 22-year-old men that have served missions. So my point is, I never really thought seriously about a mission growing up. I kind of assumed I'd go, but I was never really driven to do anything to prepare. But when I went up to Rick's, again, kind of got caught up in the current, and that's what you do. You redshirt for a year, and then you go on your mission, and you come back and you play. And so that's what I did. I'll stop there, but that's kind of what led me to my mission experience was kind of going along with the flow and not thinking too deeply about anything, just kind of doing what the others around me were doing.
So your particular testimony in your teenage and early adult years, how it was just kind of not super strong?
I was much more interested in chasing girls and playing sports. I wouldn't describe myself as a real deep or critical thinker as a teenager. In that way, I was kind of the black sheep of the family. My three siblings were much more studious and academically inclined than I was at that time. So yeah, I did not, I would do all of the things, check all the boxes.
Seminary?
No. So that was maybe one area that I pushed back on a little bit. I went, I think, my freshman and sophomore year, and then I think I might have, I can't recall if I graduated from seminary, but if I did, it was by the skin of my teeth. I mean, my junior and senior year, I was, either not going or going just enough to get credit for it. But the church was not, even in this active traditional home, the church was not something that was important to me.
Okay. And that's that wasn't because of some problem you had or concern. It was just your interests.
Yeah, it wasn't anything I was doing or not doing. It was just I never really, those hooks never got into me too deeply, I suppose.
Okay. All right. So no struggles to get your testimony or to read the Book of Mormon and pray about it or any of that stuff up through Rick's?
No. I mean, I'm sure I read the Book of Mormon, from time to time. I remember as a youth, different leaders, some, prophets or local leaders would challenge the youth of the church to read the Book of Mormon within a certain period of time. I think I did that. So I was doing these things, but nothing was really sticking for me. I mean, I was not developing an independent testimony. Now that changed a little bit on my mission. I'm going to wait to tell you about my mission until Emily catches up to me. But growing up, no, it just wasn't that important to me.
Got it. Okay, so Emily, why don't you tell us about your faith journey?
Okay. I grew up in a very orthodox, strict Mormon home. I'm one of 9 children, 3 boys, 7 girls. We were very poor growing up. I remember being on either church or government welfare, as far as I can remember, almost always. My dad was very authoritative. He was controlling, had a short temper. Mormonism was important to him, and I would say his relationships with his children and subsequently, also his wife were not the most important thing to him. There was, I think at least for the older children, some physical abuse, definitely emotional and verbal abuse growing up. I would say today about 8 out of the 10 children do not have any connection with my father. I'll talk later. My parents ended up divorcing down the road. What else? My mom was a saint. I think my mom did the best she could under the circumstances of just kind of survival mode, I think, for her with that many children and the poor, the circumstances. But she also, I think, was in a position of kind of being helpless, with the situation of having so many kids and a husband who I also, my understanding was also abusive to her. My mom, as far as I'm aware, has had mentioned that to bishops over time, and the answer to her was, that he was the leader of the home, and figure things out at home type thing. So that's the dysfunctional part of my upbringing. But as far as my participation in the church, I had a great experience going to church. I had a great experience being raised Mormon, as far as hindsight. But I feel differently. But when I look back as being a child, it's hard to know, that there's more out there, and that there's, your childhood feels normal until you grow up, right? So I had a great childhood with my siblings. We all loved each other and enjoyed each other's company. A lot of entertainment going on there with each other. But I was involved in everything. Primary, young women's. I was a seminary graduate all the way through, early morning seminary, at least in Washington. My junior year, my family moved to Utah. My dad was going to go back to school. He was always working on some degree or doing something new. He was kind of a dreamer. So what else? I did all the typical things. Girls' camp. I enjoyed girls' camp. I had great experiences in young women's.
Well, unlike me, you grew up in, high school, where, at least before you moved to Utah, where you were the minority, and you kind of prided yourself, didn't you, on?
Yeah. Oh, certainly.
Being Mormon.
Yeah. No, I did, in that I felt like I stood out. I felt like Mormonism was it was kind of a badge of honor. Getting up for early morning seminary and having a leg up when I got to school. So no, I valued, I wouldn't say I was self-righteous, but I maybe walked around with a little skip in my step because I was Mormon. It made me different from others, and that was a good thing in my mind.
Okay, so for you, Emily, in terms of your upbringing and your faith, did you try to find out that the church was true? Did you feel like you had a solid basis for your testimony even when you were a teenager?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I was constantly, if I was assigned to read the Book of Mormon, I would do that. And if things were going well in my life, I attributed that to I'm doing everything right. I'm reading my Book of Mormon. I'm saying my prayers. I'm doing everything that I'm asked to, and I feel like the blessings that I'm receiving are because of my obedience. And did I have? I don't remember having any lightning bolt. People talk of these lightning bolt experiences where they knew the church was true without a shadow of a doubt. Mine would have been over time, and just kind of a basic understanding that if I was happy that I was doing these things, then the church must be true.
So, did you, Emily, have a dream of kind of what you wanted your Mormon marriage to be like? Do you think you had a sense of that? And if so, what was it?
Well, sure, I did. It was a returned missionary, someone who held the priesthood and held it worthily, although I don't know that I knew what the meaning of that was with the father that I was raised with, right? But yes, this vision of a temple marriage to a returned missionary that, I would make sure that was in my future. That was always the goal, for sure.
Something that I found, just as kind of a coach timeout, is that in mixed faith marriages, oftentimes when one member of the partnership grew up in a home that was dysfunctional or part faith, or just experienced any sort of trauma or dysfunction in the home, that can often make that person cling more tightly to the church and their ideals for what they wanted in a marriage and in the church, because they they have this sense that my upbringing wasn't great. It was subpar. It was sad. It was dysfunctional or broken. And so I'm going to have that kind of perfect ideal marriage where the church is the thing that binds us together and keeps us from falling apart. Did you feel like that maybe was part of what you brought to your marriage?
I guess there was no other option. Like, that was the only paradigm that I brought to the marriage. It would be this way. It would only be this way. The church is true. Marriage is eternal. There is one way to be married, and it's in the temple and for eternity with one person. So, yeah, I mean, there was just no other reality in my mind but that.
Got it. So is there anything else you guys want to share about your stories before your meeting? Anything that's important to your Mormon story? I guess, Kyle, you ended up serving a mission, right?
I did.
So did you have kind of a big conversion, or did you go on your mission kind of lukewarm?
Yeah, I wanted to talk. Thank you for asking just a little bit about my mission. So I actually went out on my mission without any viable testimony that the church was true. Again, that's what all the other freshmen at Rick's College that played football were doing, and sure, that sounds good. Again, not a real deep thinker at the time, and so I served my mission in New Jersey, of all places, and a couple of comments about my mission. So one of my lasting memories of my mission was my first Zone conference. So for most of our listeners may know what Zone conference is, but it's basically a monthly meeting on your mission where all of the missionaries in a given zone, and I think we were talking maybe 50 or 60 missionaries, convene at the most convenient chapel, and the mission president leads the discussion, and it's basically a meeting with a testimony meeting session and some other things. Well, my first Zone conference, I was out on my mission for a month or less than a month, and the first session of this Zone conference was a session that my mission president called accountability. And what they did was they rolled in a great big green chalkboard on wheels into the front of just below the podium. My mission president called accountability. And what they did was they rolled in a great
That rolled on.
Keep going.
Okay, so they roll in the big green chalkboard, and on the chalkboard are 7 to 10 categories of basically statistical categories, and each companionship had to stand up and account, hence the name accountability. You had to account for your performance the previous week. And so these categories were, how many discussions did you teach the previous week? How many copies of the Book of Mormon did you hand out? How many investigators did you bring to church? And on, and ultimately, how many baptisms did you have? And I remember getting up with my trainer at this first Zone conference, and I had no idea that I was going to be standing in front of the mission president and 50 or 60 missionaries, and we were going to have to literally write our statistics up on this board for all the Zone to see. And we had not had a very good week the previous week. And so our statistics looked really, really bad compared to the rest of the missionaries. And I just remember feeling just horribly embarrassed, that I was, somehow not the missionary that these other companionships were. And from that moment on my mission for the next close to 2 years, my mission, unfortunately, in a lot of ways, became an exercise in this accountability, where I was, and I think a lot of the missionaries in my mission were very much concerned with statistics and optics. And so, that became very early on and continued throughout my mission to be one of, if not the driving motivation, is for me to compete. I'm a competitive person. My friends and family would tell you that maybe that's a fault, but I bought into that. And so I dove in, and I was on my mission, a grinder. I mean, I was working hard and, doing everything I could do. I do remember at times, particularly in weeks that were leading up to his own conference where we'd have to stand up and account, we would stay out a little bit later and as the door is closing in our face, try to get enough principles in to be able to count that discussion as an official discussion that we could put up on the chalkboard. So that was happening. I did have a successful mission. I towards the end of my mission became an assistant to the president and served in that capacity. I do think that I developed a testimony on my mission. Looking back at it, I think that it was more of I would describe it as a manufactured testimony. A mission is, I haven't served in the military, but I've heard the comparison drawn, and I think it's a good one. You're up at 6:30 and you're praying, and then you're studying the scriptures, and then you're studying with your companion, and then you're studying alone, and then you're praying, and then you're out the door by 9:30, and you have a schedule to keep, and you're testifying of the truthfulness of the church, over and over again. And through the course of that, I do think that I developed a testimony, and I do believe that when I was telling people the church was true, that I believed it. I do think that. I don't want to get too far ahead, but anyway, so I would say I had a positive, successful mission, albeit motivated for the wrong reasons, motivated for my own ego, if you will, but served an honorable mission, and came back home in, I guess, the summer of 1998, and had no my intention was to stay active in the church, to get married in the temple. I mean, I was in a window of my life, my mission, and for 2 or 3 years afterwards, where I was fully active and fully a believer. And it was during that period, that window of activity, when I met Emily.
Okay, so I mean, if you reach the level of assistant to the president, that means you were a pretty intense missionary, and I'm sure you would have perceived yourself as having a very strong, solid testimony. No? Yeah, no,
I think that I did. Again, my mission was, this sounds silly, but it was a competition. I remember in these zone conference meetings, well, particularly when I was an assistant to the president, I would travel with the other assistant, with the mission president, and we would put on these meetings, monthly meetings. And they would always end with a testimony session. And I can remember, missionaries getting up and bearing their testimony, and, someone saying, I was saying my prayers, I was on my knees saying my prayers last night, and I didn't dare open my eyes, because if I would have opened my eyes, I was just sure the Savior was standing next to me. And, and then we would travel to the next zone 2 or 3 days later, and, you'd hear a similar type of, but maybe even a little bit more embellished, of how another missionary was spiritual or that close, literally, to the Savior. And I'm sure I bore my testimony, in that respect, or in that way as well. So yeah, to answer your question, I do think that I had a testimony, and I was not afraid to use it on my mission.
Okay. All right. So who wants to tell the story? Emily, is there anything else you want to share about your life prior to meeting Kyle as it relates to kind of your faith journey?
No, other than I ticked all the boxes, of what I should be doing to navigate my way through Mormonism to be the best Mormon I could be, for sure. Mormonism was important to me.
You're in it to win it. Mm-hmm. Okay, so how'd you guys meet?
Well, Kyle played football at Rick's, and I was in the sports medicine program, the athletic training program. That's how we crossed paths and started dating. I think the first time you ever saw me, it was Tuesday devotionals at Rick's College.
Remember it well. I can remember exactly what you were wearing when I saw you for the first time.
And,
is it kind of a little bit prestigious at a BYU school to date a football player? Was that kind of cool for you or not? Or
well, other than that, I dated a few previously. And so when he came along, I was sure I was done dating football players. I wasn't seeking out football players. That just so happened to be who you would run into. We were in the same circles because of what my schooling was in.
Okay.
So I also ran into basketball players and female basketball players, and so it wasn't just football players. But I don't know. It was a prestigious. I wasn't seeking that, but that's who we ran into each other. He would claim I was a water girl. That is not the case. In fact,
well, she'd come out to the football practices. She was a student trainer, so the team would be out on the field, and I do remember seeing you out on the
water.
field, and from time to time you carried water. But she was
out to the field.
She was an athletic trainer.
Out to the field,
for the record.
Mostly for the injured. Those who were injured. Although he was never injured.
I thought about faking a groin injury and going into the training room.
The truth about that is they would not let females work on groins in the sports medicine church school. So we wouldn't get practice with groins. We'd have to wait till we left and got out into the real world to work on groins. We digress. So anyway, when we met, it was I had done a summer term at Rick's College, and now we were into the fall. And he had returned from his mission, and it was my first semester in college that we met. And we met towards the end of the semester, and we dated. Let's see. So we met in November, and we were engaged by May. So super quick, as is the case in Mormonism typically.
Wow. So what do you think about that?
There are faster.
Yeah.
I've known people to get married, engaged
faster. A little more detail. So I do remember that I was clearly interested. What's not to be interested in? And I had to be very persistent. Maybe some of those mission skills were put to good use, but I was persistent and continued to, go over to Emily's apartment. And the one advantage I had was at the time I had a Toyota truck. And Emily didn't have a vehicle. And so I could offer her rides, or if she needed to run to the grocery store. So I kind of used that as kind of my in. So I did have to work at it to get her to notice me. But I think once we started to spend some time together, I think it clicked. And probably November, December of 1998, and really from that day forward, we were inseparable. We were. And maybe that was one of the reasons that it happened quickly, other than just kind of Mormon culture, right? You find somebody, I checked the boxes she needed checked, and I was highly motivated as well, and so we moved pretty quickly. But that was a fun time. It was a quick courtship and engagement, but I look back on that fondly.
Yeah, same. Small town, so there's not a whole lot to do but hang out and be with each other, and in the bitter cold in Rexburg, Idaho. So it was fast, but we enjoyed each other's company, talking for hours on end.
This was before cell phones. So I remember staying up till, 3 or 4 in the morning with the one phone, and, I was living with 5 other guys, and
they're fighting for the phone
with the one landline. I do want to say, when I proposed to Emily, it was the traditional proposal, took a knee. Went out to a nice dinner, and I made...
In Sundance.
It was at Sundance. And I made several specific promises, including that I planned to honor my priesthood, that I planned to be a worthy priesthood holder. And at the time, I completely meant it. I mean, that was not anything I felt like I should say or needed to say. That was just what was in my heart. And that'll come up later, but I made that warranty and representation that I would be all in the church, and really had every reason to think that would be the case.
So your faith crisis started after your marriage.
Yes.
So there was no bait and switch involved.
No. Not at all. And like I said, we met in if I look back, I'm 41 years old now. We met during a very narrow window for me where I was active in the church. The 2 years on my mission, and then for a few years after, that was the window. But we met, and I'm glad we did, because
We may have missed that
had
opportunity.
I had a faith crisis before I'd met Emily, I wouldn't have checked the box. So I'm glad it was within that window.
Well, and he was teaching gospel doctrine, if I remember,
Yeah.
at Rick's College, post-mission. I had no other, indication that he was not all in. I mean, we're at a church school, and he's here, and we're both buying into it all the way.
Okay, so you get married in the temple. Anything we should know prior to Kyle, you starting to lose your faith? Anything we should know about your marriage that is relevant to the story?
Well, we found out we were pregnant 6 months after we were married.
Well, let's back up. I would like to say about the marriage ceremony. So I'm 19, Kyle's 22. His parents are divorced. We hadn't mentioned that. My parents are separated. When I went off to college, my mom, there were some events leading up to my mom realizing that basically she didn't envision eternity with this guy, with her husband, with my dad. It did not sound enticing to her. And she had, I think the straw that broke the camel's back was my sister, Charity, was getting married outside of the church. And my dad would not walk her down the aisle at her wedding because it wasn't a Mormon wedding. And that was the summer that I started college at Rick's. And so I was off at Rick's doing that and was learning from some of my siblings that things were tense between mom and dad, and mom was considering leaving dad. And I think the timing of all that, she also had the support from her active brothers, an active uncle of hers, and my two oldest siblings, men, two brothers, who were learning about what had been going on, and were giving her the support to be able to actually, leave my dad, and that it was not a good situation, and that she was validated in leaving my dad. So they were separated at the time we were planning for the wedding, and it came down to who were going to be the witnesses at our wedding. So my dad, I was communicating with him a little bit during this time, and he was sure that it should be him to be the witness at our wedding. And I didn't feel that he should, or that it was justified, or that he had the right necessarily to. And I told him no, that I was considering one of my older brothers. And I remember him saying that that it is his right, and he's the priesthood holder, and that he should be the witness at our wedding. And in the end, I chose my brother Ben, and Kyle chose his brother Ryan. So leading into that, that will play in, the reason for my telling this will play in a little bit later, but that was the ceremony. Kyle's dad was not in the temple. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, it's probably
give a
beyond
background.
the scope of this interview, but my dad had been excommunicated from the church. And so as close as I was, and Emily was and is to my dad, he was not in the temple. He was not able to participate in that pretty exciting day.
Okay, so a little bit of family, maybe some family drama leading up to the wedding and connected with the wedding. Some parental question marks or instability, or how would you describe it?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think my reason for bringing that up is that I would, if we could get married over again, Kyle's dad would be there, and not my dad. And I feel like in that way, temples separate families. And the person that deserved to be there wasn't there. And although my dad was a temple recommend holding member of the church, he had no right to be there. And if we were to do it over again, Lynn would be there. But I also, that plays a role later when I look at my children and the potential that their dad would also not be at their temple wedding. So that's why I bring that up.
Yeah, I think that's common, just especially if someone's a convert or, they have inactive parents. And when people go through a faith crisis, they just really regret how many times they just didn't even really think about what it might be like for their parent to really just not be there. It was just like, well, this is what we do, and so I can't be there, mom or dad or grandma or grandpa or aunt or uncle or close friend. And people, that's a source of pain for a lot of people. So thanks for sharing something so hard.
Yeah.
And we were 19. I didn't think about anybody but myself at that wedding.
I mean, we were so young.
You were 22.
22 and 19. I mean, we would do a lot of things differently. And we can talk about, we'll talk a little bit later about, kind of how old I was when I feel like I grew into my adult brain and started making decisions based on what I wanted to do, instead of based on what I perceived other people wanted me to do. But back then, it's over my head.
So anything else you want to share?
No, sorry.
No, that
backed it up.
Don't apologize. That was powerful. Yeah. Okay. So what happened, Kyle?
So we finished. I actually never graduated from Rick's College. As I said, I was playing football, and so we were married, and played my sophomore fall season of football at Rick's, and played well enough where I had the opportunity to continue to play football, and had a scholarship, more or less, to go play football at Bucknell University, which is out in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. So it's central Pennsylvania. Not much. There's several Amish communities nearby, but not much else. But it was a great opportunity. Small liberal arts school, and so Emily and we had just found out
literally days. It was
days
January
before
1st.
we got in a U-Haul and drove from Utah to Pennsylvania that Emily was pregnant. And so off we went to Bucknell. And my education at Bucknell is something that I will always cherish. I just met a lot of very interesting people. There was a great amount of diversity, small class sizes. I sound like I'm on a commercial or infomercial for the school. But I remember just being, and again, 22, 23 years old, just completely invigorated by learning. And took a lot of interesting classes. The one that I want to touch on, and probably my favorite class that I took at Bucknell, was a class called the Philosophy of Peace and Nonviolence. And in that class, we read Mahatma Gandhi, who's kind of the godfather of the nonviolent movement. We read Henry David Thoreau. We read Martin Luther King. And then after we'd read all those people, we read Jesus Christ. But I'm in a class with 12 other students. The professor is not Christian, and we're reading Christ's words and his philosophy on nonviolence, just as we were reading the other authors. And for some,
just from a historical perspective,
not as the Son of God, not that he's deity, but he's just another voice who had something to say on the subject. And that was really mind-blowing for me. Not that I, at the time, began to doubt Christianity. I wouldn't say that, but it just opened my mind was beginning to expand in a lot of ways. As I was taking those classes, and I guess I should have gone back on my mission. There were several times on my mission where we would be knocking on doors, and in the back and forth we had with people we were talking to, we were trying to hand them a copy of the Book of Mormon or a pamphlet, and a lot of people over the course of 2 years would hand back information. And I remember on my mission receiving some pamphlets from people either on their doorstep or in a park that would talk about things that I thought were just shocking and untrue and appalling. Things like how the Book of Mormon was really translated. Things like the Book of Abraham. And while I was on my mission, I remember I was in Toms River, New Jersey, about 3 months into my mission, when someone handed me a pamphlet for the first time about Joseph Smith and, basically looking into a hat to translate the Book of Mormon. And at the time, I thought, this is preposterous. This is nothing I've ever been told. It can't be true. I remember walking back home that night with my companion, thinking this is, I think my companion called it spiritual pornography. You just shouldn't be entertained, and how dare they? And I got home from my mission and began to think about that, and began to become curious, or more curious. And so eventually started to do some reading. And this is, on top of all the other reading I'm doing at Bucknell. And started to actually study and learn some church history that had not been disclosed to me at any point. I mean, I was growing up, as I told you, I was attending all my meetings and checking all my boxes. But 2 books that I want to mention that I read, and this would have been in the 2000 and 2001 timeframe, I believe. A book called Mormon Enigma, which is a book written by a couple of professors, I believe, from the University of Illinois. John, you may know their names.
Linda K. Newell.
And someone else. But
Valine Tippett.
The book is interesting in that it's packed with historical content. So all of their sourcing is journal entries, affidavits, court records, but it's written from Emma Smith's perspective. And it goes into great detail about, it talks about the Book of Mormon translation, but it talks in great detail about polygamy. And for me, that was, again, just new information that I'd never heard. Let me refer back to my mission one more time. On my mission, there were times, more than a handful of times, where I had to defend polygamy, either during a discussion or in someone's home or on the street. And the way that I had heard it defended by my trainer, by the zone leader, by other kind of missionaries that I looked up to, was that what we were supposed to say if polygamy came up, of course we wouldn't bring it up, but if it came up, we were supposed to say that, yes, the church practiced polygamy for a short period of time, but the reason for that was the church was, people were threatened by the church, and so the church body had to move. They migrated from New York to Ohio to Nauvoo, and during the course of this migration, there were several battles or skirmishes where some of the men were killed, and leaving a lot of widows. And so because women outnumbered men, these women, couldn't support themselves. And so kind of as a humanitarian effort, these men who had survived the battles would take on more than one wife, but it was, for the benefit of these poor women whose husbands had been killed in battle. And that was kind of the accepted narrative or explanation on polygamy that I then used for the next 2 years. I can still remember telling people and arguing with people and testifying that was what happened. And so fast forward to post-mission and post-marriage, and I'm learning that's not at all what happened. And I went through several different emotions, but the one that really stuck with me was I just felt like I had been deceived. I felt like I had been, not told the truth, and then sent out as a tool, as a beacon for the church to go perpetuate these untruths. And I absolutely became angry. The other book that I read that was influential to me was Fawn Brody's No Man Knows My History. And in reading those two books, and I'm sure I read others in this early 2000 time frame, for me, the wheels fell off the wagon pretty quickly. And around this time, I remember it may have been in a general conference if Gordon B. Hinckley was still the prophet. I don't know how. He was he was my prophet, right? I mean, I served my mission from 96 to 98. He was the prophet. So he was the guy. And it was either shortly after my mission or around this time, this early 2000s, where I either heard him or read his kind of, I call it the sudden death theory, where he said, and I think he may have been quoting previous prophets, Joseph Fielding Smith, I think, where he says either Joseph Smith was called of God and had the first vision and translated the Book of Mormon and is to be revered as the prophet of the restoration, or he is a complete fraud. There can be no middle ground, is what I remember reading from my prophet, Gordon B. Hinckley. And it hit me. I agree with you, President Hinckley. There can be no middle ground here. Either all of those things happened or none of them happened. And for me, it was clear. It was black and white. Lost my testimony. And, was sure of it. I wasn't on the fence. Like I said, it happened pretty quickly. And that's in a nutshell how I lost my faith.
And this would have been around what year?
2001. I think we were still at Bucknell. I graduated Bucknell in May of 2002. So in that 2001, 2002 time frame.
So I have a question. And I don't know that you're going to be able to answer this, but one of the things that's kind of mind-blowing is, Fawn Brody's No Man Knows My History was written and published like in 1945. Like, books have been around forever that would give people cause to study and doubt and even leave the church. So just the mere existence of a book doesn't, or even someone reading a book doesn't mean they're going to leave. There are people who have read No Man Knows My History. Like, I think Bill Reel at one point said he read that book while he was an investigator and he joined anyway. I could have my memory wrong, but my point is, just having a troubling history book or even reading it for many people means nothing to their testimony. What do you think it was about your testimony, your experience, that number one made you want to read that, made you curious enough, made you courageous enough, or interested enough, or faithless enough, or whatever you want to use as an adjective? And then what made you open and willing to ask that question, is it possible it's not really true? Because so many of us, when we were confronted with anti-Mormon literature or real accurate history, we just brushed it off and blew it off and discarded it. Have you done any introspection as to what made you ripe for that at such a young age? And before, it was cool
Yeah.
You know, to leave the church.
Yeah.
And I don't mean it's cool to leave the church. I just
But
mean
before the internet.
before it's popular.
Before the internet,
you know,
before Mormon Stories.
What made you open to that?
So I think a lot of it was, like I said, my mind was just blowing up with ideas at Bucknell were flying around like bullets. Another part of it is probably my brother and my dad. Now they were not feeding me information, or my brother ended up leaving the church a little bit before I did. And so conversations with my brother, I think that's where I heard that this book, No Man Knows My History, was out there. So conversations with my brother, conversations with my dad, there was no persuasion going on, but it was just awareness, creating awareness. And I took that awareness and went and found the books, and really kind of became fascinated by it too. It was not just the loss of my faith. It was historically interesting to me. I mean, the history of I still call it our church. The history of the church is just amazing. And particularly it's amazing when it's very different than the Disneyland whitewashed version that I grew up, believing was true. So there was a lot of that, but I would say that my family, my brother and my dad, were probably important in that process, at least for just saying, hey, there's, if that's bothering you, if these things you learned on your mission are concerning you, there's information out there. Because I just didn't know. I didn't know these books.
Did you respect your dad and brother then? Was that part of it? You just really respected them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.